And welcome to the Glenorchy City Council workshop. It's an open workshop tonight, dated 7th of July 2025. Firstly, we have the acknowledgement of country. I would like to acknowledge the Muranina people as the traditional owners of this land and recognise the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the original owners and continuing custodians of the land and waters and sky of this island of Tawita. I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present, and Glenorchy City Council is committed to working in a way that welcomes and respects all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Tonight is an open workshop being live streamed. We have these open workshops to provide the opportunity for public to participate, and we welcome everyone in the audience today. And we like to discuss subjects that are of interest to the whole community, and it also supports our work in being open and transparent wherever we possibly can. So joining me in council tonight, I have Alderman Tim Marks, Alderman Peter Riddler, Alderman Justin Stringer, Councillor Molly Kendall, our Deputy Mayor Russell Yaxley, myself, Sue Hickey, Mayor, and the CEO, Emilio Reale. We have Alderman Stephen King, Alderman Stuart Slade, and Alderman Shane Alderton. Now, at the start of every meeting, whether it's an open or closed or council meeting, we always have a community update. So the council continues to take community safety seriously. However, we do know that Glenorchy has recently been subject to heightened security. And this is despite a decline in reported incidences according to the police statistics. Whilst we recognise that all communities have their fair share of antisocial behaviour and crime, this is disproportionately focused on Glenorchy, and I actually think that's quite unfair, and it is reinforcing a negative perception. Only last week, Tas Police released new data that shows a 16% fall in total offences in the Glenorchy division for the past 12 months, including a reduction in youth offending, which was reduced by 21% from 2023-24 to 2024-25. The Task Force Respect, which we are all familiar with, has made a positive impact on the city CBD areas and retail areas, with community and business members reporting a reduction in antisocial behaviour and retail crime. At the same time, Council continues to work hard to support the good work being done by the police and help shift the narrative and reaffirm that Glenorchy is a safe and welcoming community. Some of our upcoming initiatives include a full program of school holiday events being held at the Moona Arts Centre and on our council lawns. We are not only promoting these events which are run by council, but are also promoting events run by other organisations during the school holidays. So please keep an eye on our social media and check our website for more information. This Thursday, the 10th of July, we are partnering with Tasmania Police to hold a pop-up store focusing on community safety at Northgate. That's the Northgate Shopping Centre from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. This stall aims to engage with the community on safety, crime prevention and youth issues. Community members will have the opportunity to speak directly with Inspector Jason Klug and the Council Safety City Lead, Ben Hughes. Next Tuesday, 5:30 p.m, Council will host a community yarn at the Girl Guides Hall in Claremont that will also focus on community safety. And this session is a chance for residents and community groups and businesses in the area to raise concerns or issues about safety in their neighbourhoods, and will help us and our partners better understand local safety priorities. At this stage, we're expecting Tas Police, Crime Stoppers and Neighbourhood Watch representatives to attend the yarn. We are also supporting Crime Stoppers Tasmania to distribute their newly designed posters, which you can see on the screen, which I think they're actually fantastic. So there's magnets, I believe there's stickers and posters, and we will be helping them to distribute those throughout the businesses of Glenorchy. And as you can see, these examples of the collateral, they're very much about reinforcing that you can report anonymously, and by reporting you can help the police to quickly resolve issues and also lock up offenders, hopefully. At the May Council meeting, we endorsed a statement of commitment on community safety to demonstrate our dedication to and outline our influence in fostering a safe, inclusive and welcoming community. I cannot stress enough how important this is to us. This statement of commitment will be posted on our website and promoted on all our social media channels. Now, the pool. Hutchison's builders are on track to start the pool repair work in August. This is the earliest they can start. We will hold a media event to mark the beginning of this work. Probably deserves a celebration after all the stop-starts. In addition to letters to all Clark candidates in the upcoming election outlining our priority projects for funding, including the redevelopment of the pool, that is the really big project, letters have also gone to the leaders of both major parties, Jeremy Rockcliffe and Dean Winter. Citizenship ceremonies. Tomorrow, over 100 people will participate in one of two citizenship ceremonies to become Australian citizens. We are hosting both events at the Moona Arts Centre, one at 2:30 p.m. and the other at 5 p.m. It'd be really great if any elected members could come along and support. That would be great. Now, it is my great honour to introduce today's guest speaker, Ms. Ben Maloney. Ben, would you like to take a seat at the table there? Ben is a project director, a brilliant project director from the Department of State Growth, and he's going to tell us the story of how the Bridgewater Bridge project was completed to enormous relief, and it's a fabulous bridge. So over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, and I guess certainly appreciate the opportunity to present on the project. It's been a wonderful opportunity to have worked on this project on behalf of Tasmania. So getting to the end of it now, with the completion of the project, it is so good to get out and talk about how we went through the process, what worked, what perhaps we found more challenging, and how we got through it all. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Can everyone hear down the back? Yep, right, thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the presentation, what I was looking to do is provide a short overview and status of the project as it stands at the moment, run through some of the project challenges, because any project of this scale and complexity needed to face a range of challenges, and we work through those. Run through our procurement approach. I think one of the successful aspects of the project was how we worked with industry successfully in a collaborative way, and really that came right at the early stages when we were designing and implementing the actual procurement. Then run through the construction, so how we achieved access and how we undertook the actual construction works. Touch on our precast yard, which was located close to our construction site and was so important for delivering this project successfully. And then run through some of the concluding works, including the demolition of the existing bridge, and leave time for questions.
Right, this is the first video.
Excellent. So this will just run through our most recent fly through on site, to give you a perspective of the project, and I'll run through the project while that's playing, sort of basically the background. Wait for it to come on. Oh, good. So as people would be familiar, the new Bridgewater Bridge project is a $786 million project. It's jointly funded by the Australian and Tasmanian governments. It was actually funded 80% by the Australian government, 20% by the Tasmanian government. It delivered a new bridge, 4 lanes wide, 1.2 kilometres long, which has crossed the River Derwent approximately 20 kilometres north of Hobart, as you'd be aware. It caters for approximately about 23,000 vehicles per day, so essentially the southern end of the Midland Highway. And the project included new grade separated interchanges. Those were important in addressing pre-existing traffic congestion, particularly on the southern side of the river, where we had the junction of the Brooker Highway, the Lyell Highway and the Midlands Highway, all trying to squeeze through the roundabout at the end of the causeway there. So I guess in terms of scale, indicatively the bridge represented about 2/3 of the cost of our project, and those interchanges that I mentioned probably about 1/3 the cost of the project. So it gives you a bit of perspective there. It was also important that the project minimised traffic disruptions throughout construction, and the installation of the temporary bridge consisting of both the barges and also the fixed structure was so important for achieving those minimising the traffic congestion, minimising inconvenience and providing access for our construction. So I'll touch on why that was so important for us later in the presentation. The bridge superstructure itself is supported by piles that are about 2.5 metres in diameter, and some of them go as deep as 90 metres deep into the water. So that's the equivalent length of a soccer field. So massive piles holding up our bridge. The bridge itself has a posted speed limit of 80 kilometres per hour, primarily governed by the safe use of the on-ramps and the off-ramps at either end. The bridge has a 3 metre wide shared user path on the upstream side and safety barriers on both sides. And in terms of navigation, under the new bridge, the navigation clearance is 16.2 metres and a minimum 45 metres wide. So that's consistent with the navigation channel underneath the Bowen Bridge, which is located downstream. To achieve that navigation clearance, we will need to include the demolition of the existing bridge, so the old 1940s steel frame lifting span bridge, which was actually the fourth bridge built in this crossing. So the new bridge is the fifth. While we will be removing the majority of that 1940s steel bridge, we will be retaining the causeway. So in terms of the causeway, that was actually built by convicts between about 1810 and 1830, and that will remain in place. So this slide just touches on some of the stats in relation to our project. So I mentioned the piles before and the piers. So there was 46 marine piles and 42 piers. And I'll touch on how we constructed the segments and the construction of the bridge later in the presentation. So in terms of status, hopefully you'll be aware we did open the bridge at the beginning of June. And so far at this stage we're continuing to complete the finishing works, in particular the intersections at the end of the causeway and at the Bridgewater side. And then shortly following that we will proceed through the demolition of the existing bridge. So why was a new bridge needed? I think really to put it in really simple terms, the existing bridge was the weak link in our Midland Highway. People would know that the state has been investing in the Midland Highway over the last more than 10 years now, undertaking significant upgrade works. The old bridge, it was one lane in each direction, 60 kilometres an hour. In terms of freight, it was weight limited, it was size limited. It just wasn't meeting the future needs of Tasmania. In addition to that, the unique, I guess, aspect of the old bridge was its lifting span. The lifting span was becoming increasingly unreliable. It was incurring more significant maintenance over time and was likely to cost significant money to continue its operations if they were able to be safely continued into the future. So the combination of all that resulted in a business case to replace the bridge and, as I mentioned before, those intersections. We did do a range of cost-benefit analysis of the project and looking at only the aspects around freight improvements, efficiencies and direct benefits. We're able to demonstrate a rate of return which on the basis of a 5% discount rate. So if people have done business cases before, they'd appreciate that you can use a range of numbers in terms of the discount rate, which is effectively the value of money that you place on it. So we were able to break even at about 5%. But what I'd probably highlight is really that was the direct benefits that the Australian government considers suitable for consideration in their business cases. The reality is there's a lot of flow-on impacts or benefits of projects of this scale, which are indirect, and they were, I guess, identified as having substantial benefits for the state and for the local communities. In terms of the challenges that we faced, the reality is that we haven't built a bridge of this scale here in Tasmania for quite some time. So if you think of the last really big bridge project here in Tasmania, it would have been the Bowen Bridge back in the 1980s. And we weren't likely to build a bridge of that scale again in the near future. So that influenced partially how we actually approached the project in terms of how we structured our team, how we procured the project and the likes. Also the fact that we were aware right from the start that the site had quite complicated constraints that we needed to work to. So, for example, we have about 600 or 700 metres of mud flats that were too shallow to efficiently use floating plant, but too unstable to use land-based equipment. And then we also had the navigation channel on the Bridgewater side, which was much deeper and again unsuitable for land-based equipment. So we had to work out a way of providing access across those different conditions. Also the actual ground conditions underneath where we're building the bridge, the actual geotechnical conditions there was such a mix of different rock types. It was like a fruitcake of different rocks all the way through from one side to the other. So we needed a design solution that could be suitable in all of those different conditions. We also had to navigate quite complex planning approval processes. So at the time which the project was heading into its delivery phase, planning and delivery phase, the state government was putting in place new major projects legislation. So at the time we were planning our project, it hadn't actually been drafted and it certainly hadn't passed government. So we needed to forecast the processes that we followed, timeframes and the likes, in the absence of actually having that planning process in place. And when it was in place, we then had to basically be the first cab off the rank, the first pilot project to run through that process. And we were learning as we went through that process as much as the regulators themselves. And that process, I guess, enabled us to secure the planning approval in an efficient way, and I'll outline sort of briefly how that went through. But it was so important because the project was spanning 3 local government areas, including Glenorchy City Council. It also spanned a marine reserve, and it involved a large number of different stakeholders. So having a process that incorporated the feedback and the input from all of those key stakeholders was very important. Throughout our project, we needed to make sure that we were building and training a skilled workforce. So try to get the most social and economic benefits from our project was so important for a project of this scale. We also needed to keep the existing bridge open and operating throughout construction. I mentioned before, minimising impacts on traffic, including providing access to all the surrounding private properties and businesses, and basically keeping everything operating as efficiently as possible throughout the project. So where are we now? Having faced all those challenges, we're basically at the tail end of a 6-year project. So people talk about this project being around for many decades, and it certainly has been talked about for many decades. Really, I guess the project that I've been involved with, it kicked off at the end of 2019. So my Deputy Project Director, Kevin Bourne, was sort of the founding member, and he really sort of started forming the team. I came on board about halfway through 2020. By then, the team had already undertaken a range of geotechnical investigations, further development of concept designs and information such as that. So by the middle of 2020, there was a fair indication, a fair understanding of the nature of the project, and they were able to reach that point so quickly because of the 2 decades or so of previous work being undertaken by various parties. So that's more or less when we launched into preparing ourselves for the planning approval process and for our procurement processes. Effectively, there was about 2.5 years of solid planning, procurement, getting ourselves organised to deliver the project, and then that was followed by 3 years of successful construction, which brings us more or less to today, where we're now closing out the construction works and undertaking the project closeout. In terms of the procurement, I mentioned before, I think that was so important for our project. What we did was actually, we recognised that we were looking for effectively a strong collaboration with our successful contractor. So what we chose to do was basically put a request for proposal out to industry broadly, and then select 2 preferred tenderers to work with. And we engaged each of those contractors that we selected, 2 of them, engaged them under an early contractor involvement contract, where we would reimburse them part of their costs for developing their proposals. And their proposals involved detailed tender designs. They included work method statements of how they would actually deliver the project, as well as their pricing of the project and ensuring that they provided us with competitive pricing. And we're then able to compare the two tenders and select our preferred contractor from that. And that presented a whole range of benefits. We got to work with our contract, with each of our two tenderers for an 8-month period. We got to understand how each of them operated. We ensured that the designs that they developed were fit for purpose and suitable and aligned with our needs. And as I mentioned before, by our contractors working through that so thoroughly, we were able to get competitive pricing that was sensible at the same time. There's nothing worse than getting a low tender in a job because a tender has stuffed up because they don't know, they didn't appreciate a particular risk. We were able to work through all the risks and make sure the parties understood them. Also through that process, what we're able to do is better understand some of the requirements in terms of the commercial agreement that were unacceptable to the broader market. Quite often as a client, particularly in Tasmania, we'll go out with a general standard set of contract conditions, and our expectation on our contractors is that they will comply with those conditions, and we'll just assess tenders on other aspects. Because in this situation, we're working with tier 1 contractors that don't work in Tasmania very often, and it's a very large scale project, we went to market with what we thought was an appropriate market position. And as a client, we wanted as much risk with the contractor as possible, but not an unreasonable risk they weren't able to manage. So through that 8-month process, we got feedback from both tenderers, and we were able to ascertain which areas were perhaps not on market, and perhaps we were going to end up paying more for the risk that we're trying to transfer. So we actually adjusted how we some of the risk transfer and accepted certain risks to come back towards the state, but in a way where we understood how we would manage those. So that again, when we closed the tender process, we received tenders with commercial terms which were generally on market and acceptable to the state, and each contractor was also able to bid back particular clauses. So that, I think, put us in a good position to then do a apples for apples comparison of our tenders and award our contract to our preferred contractor. Throughout that whole process though, our planning approval process was not moving at the rate which we had assumed when we first set up the program for our project. And that was because we were having to set up those timeframes without the legislation having been written, and also without understanding how the regulators were going to approach some of those. So I guess what we saw evolving while we were working in that commercial in confidence tender process with our contractors, we were going through our publicly open process of the planning approval. And what we're identifying essentially was that whilst the legislation had allowed for some level of optioneering in terms of the project proposal, ultimately a number of the regulators found that it wasn't possible to complete their initial assessment without seeing a set of plans. They needed to have the concept plan. So whilst we prosecuted the argument that, well, it's going to be along this alignment, it's not going to be higher than this, it's going to be built out of concrete, we can give you a lot of specifics. At the end of the day, probably quite reasonably, they said, no, we need to see a concept plan. And we couldn't provide that for our preferred tender until we selected our preferred tender. And you'd appreciate that when you're running a commercial in confidence tender process for over $500 million worth of work, both tenderers were quite reluctant to have information about their designs released until we'd gone through that process. So it was probably only 2 or 3 days after we selected our preferred tenderer that we more or less grabbed half a dozen of their plans, stapled them back to the other 4,000 pages or so of documentation that supported our major project's impact statement, which the regulators had already had the opportunity to look at. And then from there, it moved quite efficiently and quickly through the process. And I think that was a really good process on both sides. It meant that the regulators saw the vast majority of the information early, but that concluding information that they needed to then take the next step, were able to provide, was able to be assessed quickly, and we moved into the review process. We received so that was in the end of November. by May the following year, we were granted the permit to proceed with the project. We were able to award the D&C deed and proceed with construction works on schedule in October the following year. So May, permit, July, contract, October, commencement of construction. But the only reason we're able to do that without delay to the project is throughout that process, we actually implemented an early activities deed, and that enabled us to commercially commit to our preferred tenderer in December of the year preceding the permit. So before we had the permit, we're able to make a commitment to our contractors so they could progress with the detailed design and the documentation, all of their planning, and actually keep working for that other 6 months while we were waiting for the permit. That wasn't a minor commitment. It was in the order of $30 million worth of commitment that the state was making in anticipation of the permit, but it did save us that 6 months, and it was considered to be a commercially sensible commitment to make. I think the other advantage it meant that we kept the team from both the contractor and ourselves actively engaged and moving through the project. Quite often with projects, where they fall over is you get these points where everything has to stop for 6 months. And that's when you lose your best people. People don't like hanging around waiting for a project to kick off. So it was so important that we kept the momentum of the project going by doing that. So that meant that in October we were able to commence construction, and I was astounded by how quickly really the civil works commenced on both sides of the river as it started. And then also a key aspect from a timing perspective was the provision of access across the river. I mentioned before, the temporary bridge that we built was so critical for minimising traffic disruption. It was so important for access. That's where our contractor came up with the innovative idea of using 12 barges which were floated into place over the mudflats and settled on the mudflats and provide a stable platform, and then constructed a fixed bridge across the balance of it. So that was built by local Tasmanian contractor, Bridge Pro. Actually, they presented at a bridge conference just last week, and what they noted was, I'm just trying to remember, it was either the 5th or the 7th biggest bridge in Tasmania at the time, and that was the temporary bridge in order to build our bridge. So 300 metres long, and at the moment we're in the process of removing that bridge. So again, built by a local contractor that really developed or increased their capacity to work in this environment through this project and working with our Tier 1 contractor. Move on to us. I don't know if I'm going to be able to pause this throughout, Emma.
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. Well, we'll run it through. I'll do my best to talk as it's running through and touch on the key aspects. So this is an animation we put together to try and explain how we did construct the bridge. And this is available on our website. So if anybody wants to take the time to look at it at a later date, it is on our website. But I'll try and talk to the pace of the video, which is a little bit harder. But essentially what the video goes through is the key aspects of site establishment, the temporary bridge, piling works, pier construction, then how we created the precast units, installed them as part of our deck, and then basically completed the works. So the first aspect was getting access. So we reclaimed land on the Glenorchy side, so about 50 metres or so out into the foreshore is land reclamation, which will remain there permanently. And that was to provide us with a point at which the pontoons or the barges could be put in place. And you can see here that each one was floated into place over the mudflats, filled with ballast water, and then fixed in place with bridges spanning it between each one. We also, as I mentioned before, constructed a fixed bridge which had a steel frame and concrete decks, and that was to cover or to cross the navigation span on the northern side, and we needed one section of that to be equivalent height to the old bridge so that vessels could still go up and downstream if they could go under. Now this is where we start building the bridge itself. The piles, we were using steel casings which went between the top of the water effectively through the mud down to rock. We would then cleared effectively the material out of that steel tube and took that off site. We're then able to proceed to drill down through to the necessary depth, prop reinforcing steel and fill it with concrete. So in terms of that, the actual steel casing that went in at first is actually sacrificial. It's really just formwork. It's the reinforcing steel and the concrete that make the strength of the pile. We then placed pile caps on top, and then the piers on top of that. So the pile caps were prefabricated off-site. They were the white section that you can see in the image there, and then the blue section is the formwork for the casting of our piers. So again, they were undertaken by Bridgepro, a Tasmanian company. The actual deck is made of precast units. 1,082 units were constructed. Every single one was unique because of slightly different design, and each one was match cast. So basically what it meant is we would pour one box section, push it out, and then pour the next one against it. So there was a perfect match between those two faces, so everything fitted together on site, a bit like a Lego set. All the pieces needed to match together. They were then transported on site. The ones that go onto the pier stock were actually heavier than the others. They're probably typically about 80, 90 tonnes for each of the pier segments. And then they're all pinned together. And then from there, we were able to place what we call the field segments. They were around 60 tonnes each. And they were placed on either side and pulled back with tension to hold them in place. And what we used were what they call special segment lifter, which isn't particularly exciting in terms of its definition or title. Essentially what we had is the equivalent of cranes sitting at either end, lifting up the pieces and putting them into place. And we need to do it in a balanced way so that so it was what we call a balanced cantilever approach. So we're not putting too much weight on either side. It was able to stay balanced each way. And then concurrent with all of that were all the interchange works, other minor bridges and other works. And as you'd appreciate, the structure is just one element of the bridge. We then needed to make it suitable and safe to drive upon, so there was a range of finishing works there. With that video, because it's shown basically each thing happening at one moment in time, it looks like it's relatively simple and straightforward. You just do this bit and then you do that bit. The reality is on site, we were doing everything at once. So we were still installed in the middle, this photo's from the middle of last year, so we were still installing piles in the middle of the river. While back from that, we were replacing the pile caps on top of the completed piles, we were placing the piers on top of the completed pile caps, and in this image you can see on both images, you can see we're also placing the superstructure on top as well. So all of that work needed to be fed through that temporary bridge. So it was an absolute logistical nightmare for our contractor in terms of feeding materials and equipment to each of the different subcontractors engaged to do those works, and most particularly making sure it's done safely. So I think one of the key benefits from this project was that I think a range of quite a large number of local contractors were involved in a project that really lifted the bar in terms of safety procedures and management processes. So as you can see from the photo, in particular the one on the right hand side, how challenging it would have been throughout those works. In terms of the project, I think one of the real success stories was also our precast yard. I mentioned before, we had to produce 1,082 concrete box sections. You can see there on the bottom right-hand side, when I think that was probably close to peak storage. I think we had about 400 or 500 of them stored there on site at that time. Clearly, as they're being produced, we're trying to get them off and installed on site as quickly as possible. But at that stage, I think we almost got into triple stacking them. We were targeting just keeping it at double stacking, but at one stage we were triple stacking some of them. And in terms of that facility, it was actually a purpose-built facility leased from a developer here in Tasmania. And the real benefit of that is that at the end of the project, it remains as an asset here in Tasmania that can provide future opportunities for development. So there was a precast yard adjacent to this one, and they've now expanded into the shed that's shown there on the right-hand side. And I believe that the second shed has already been leased out to Tasmanian business. And in the future, these can be utilised for other things, such as I think that the developer, David Mariner, has talked openly about some of the aspirations to perhaps do prefabricated homes and producing those perhaps through concrete or other means. So actually, when I was speaking with the construction manager a couple of weeks ago, he mentioned that he's been on about 5 of these equivalent projects where they've set up precast yards. And in all of the previous projects, they've knocked them down at the end. This is the first time he's actually seen the asset retained by the community or by the state after the project. So that's a really good successful story. It was also the area where we felt it was probably safest and most efficient to maximise the participation of bringing people into the workforce. What we really wanted to do was target people that were coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, whether they were long-term unemployed, Aboriginal or immigrants to Australia who may have faced a range of challenges. So our contractor actually formed partnerships with a range of other groups locally to be able to support and implement packages that assisted people to come into the construction industry. And the precast yard was one particular area where, because it was more of a factory environment, that was safer to do than have them hanging off a bridge over water as their first job experience. So that's, I think, that and the fact that we're able to implement that facility close to the project reduced transport distance. One of our challenges that was particularly challenging internally within state growth, because I guess I coordinated the project as a project director, but we also had to work to the Department of State Growth as a client and also the owner of the existing bridge. So there was a strong incentive for myself and the contractor to secure approval to transport as many the southern segments across the existing bridge, but also from an asset owner, when we swap hats, we wanted to make sure the existing bridge didn't fall apart before the new bridge got built. And I'll admit the existing bridge was really at the end of its functional life. So we actually did some really quite unique and complex work around measuring the stresses and strains that the existing bridge would be under as these segments were transported across. It's important to note that the actual load itself wasn't excessive. It was just the fact that we're doing so many of them that made the engineers nervous. We do oversize, overmass loads across the existing bridge from time to time, but this was something like 500 trips in relatively quick succession. So a lot of work was done around proving that it would be safe and monitoring the condition of the bridge all the way through, so we could see it all the way through at the end. That does bring us to the demolition of the existing bridge. So as I mentioned before, it's necessary for a range of reasons, including the importance of re-establishing good navigation upriver. Since the 1940s, or in fact before, a range of bridges have been in that location with various swing spans, lifting spans in order to provide access upriver. Now that we've built the new Bridgewater Bridge at 16 metres, it does mean that vessels of that height can now, once we remove the existing bridge, can then move unimpeded up and down river. And that's quite important because we got to the point with the existing bridge where it was unsafe to raise it during strong winds, and we're unable to open it to its full height because of just engineering concerns and things like that. So it meant that if somebody did go upriver or downriver and the wind picked up, there's a possibility that they wouldn't be able to return until conditions improved. So that also removing the bridge is important from a maintenance point of view. The reality is it's an old steel structure in a marine environment. One of the unique features of our bridge is actually the welds. Back in the 1940s, the welding approach they used for the structure was relatively experimental. And that's quite interesting from an engineering and historic perspective, but it is also very challenging as an asset owner as those welds become brittle and start to fail and we have to replace them. So it was a combination of the maintenance costs and also the need to establish navigation that the basis of approval was secured to demolished most of the existing bridge. We will keep a number of the caissons. They're our main foundations below the tower structure. Similar to if you drive past today, you'll notice across the old bridge on the left-hand side, there's actually the old turnstile of one of the previous bridges. So similar to that, we will be retaining the caissons where they're not in the middle of the navigation channel. So we secured approval to remove it through that major projects permit process, subject to a range of conditions that we're now in the process of complying with.
Yeah, it's not moving.
So in terms of those conditions, part of it is making sure we take representative samples of the existing bridge so that they, and incorporating those in artwork. So we're in the process, or have very recently, I'm not sure if it's actually formally been announced, in selecting our preferred artists, and we're incorporating a number of those unique connections within the existing bridge, those joints, as part of artwork, which will feature on the Bridgewater side. And we're also looking at doing, or basically have a heritage interpretation strategy that references a range of information about the history of that crossing. As I mentioned before, there's actually been 4 bridges constructed from the end of the causeway to the Bridgewater side over the life of the crossing, with our bridge being number 5. Put the temporary bridge in there as well, you could say number 6. But yeah, so it's recognising the history of each of those projects and the history of the area more broadly, also its environmental history and also Aboriginal history. So we're working through each of those as part of our heritage interpretation strategy. Other works that we will be doing in addition to the heritage strategy, we are reinstating or building a new boat ramp on the Bridgewater side. So prior to our project, there was a relatively old boat ramp on the Bridgewater side, which we needed to build our bridge over the alignment of. So we're reinstating and building a new bridge to new boat ramp and jetty to contemporary standards at that location, and also undertaking a range of other foreshore rehabilitation works, including we will be, in terms of the existing causeway I mentioned before, that will be retained. We have approached both Derwent Valley Council and also Parks and Wildlife Services to see if anyone's interested in taking over responsibility for it. At the moment, nobody's too keen, but we're hopeful that once we remove traffic and we've rehabilitated, there may be more interest in that space, because it won't be used for roads per se. And I guess because it is a section of land that's quite unique in the middle of a marine reserve and frequented by a wide variety of bird life as well, we're hopeful that somebody will take over custodianship of that and manage and respect it in the appropriate way. In the meantime, as a responsible state government, we will continue to maintain it appropriately as well. Also, I guess as part of the heritage interpretation strategy, we've also approached the descendants of Sir Alan Knight to potentially rename or name a section of the foreshore in recognition of Sir Alan Knight as the designer of the 1940s bridge. Especially you can tell from the history, he was equivalent of sort of the Leonardo da Vinci of Tasmania back in the 1940s. He was involved in a lot of the hydro schemes as well as bridge schemes. So he was involved in designing and doing work around the Tarraleah hydro scheme, which is about the same time as this, which coincidentally they're in the process of looking to replace and refurbish as well. So the timing is consistent as such. So that was the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to open it to questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A question I have, Ben, as part of the land requirement for the construction of this bridge, you purchased the Black Snake Inn.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what the future holds for that once you remove your works depot located alongside that. So you've mentioned about remediation and historical value with the causeway, etc. There's quite a bit of considerable historical value there with the Black Snake Inn. So Are there any plans for that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a decision which ultimately has yet to be made through government, but if I was forecasting, I guess, what the general thoughts are at the moment, is the intention is that we're looking to put that back into the private sector, so basically put it on the market. The Black Snake Inn itself. So in terms of the Black Snake Inn, what we did was we recognised that it was quite important to have flexibility in how we worked and delivered our project around that property. There wasn't justification to compulsory acquire all of the property, but we needed some of the land. So what we ended up doing was reaching a voluntary agreement with the landowner. We purchased it through a voluntary purchase, with the understanding that at the end of the project there would be surplus land and property remaining, which is the Black Snake Inn itself. Through the course of the project, we've identified an area that we are using to recognise the Aboriginal history of the area. So the section more to the north, closer to the southern abutment of the bridge, we're actually in the process of finalising the design of a small sort of parkland area there, which will recognise the Aboriginal history of the area. A portion of the land we've had to utilise for urban sensitive water management. So effectively when water comes off our road, it goes through a range of ponds or settlement areas to try and take out as much of the rubbish as possible before it ends up in the river. So a portion of land has been used for that. And then from that, there'll be the balance of land surrounding the Black Snake Inn itself and the likes. We've spent $200,000 preserving and improving the actual building itself. So it was in relatively poor condition. We identified that, for instance, the chimneys were at risk of being blown over in a strong breeze, so we reconstructed those and we undertook some other works to make sure that the asset itself is preserved and protected while it's in state government ownership. But from here, what we then do is we approach Treasury, and there's a defined process for disposing of surplus property. I would anticipate that the end of that process will be for us to put it on market and try to find somebody that would love the property more than, as much as we have loved having it in our ownership.
Thank you. Any further questions? Thank you, Alderman Riddle.
Thanks for the presentation, very good. The cost of demolition of the old bridge, what's that and the time frame?
I haven't got the exact number ahead, but $14 million was the approximate estimate for demolition of the existing bridge. We awarded a contract only a couple of weeks ago, so it is on the Treasury website, the exact number, but $14 million is the cost. We have met with the contractor. We're anticipating works to commence before the end of this year and be completed in the first half of next year.
How deep is it there?
I think it varies. Again, sorry, for some reason the number of about 5 metres springs to mind, but to be honest, I'm just guessing. I need to come back.
As a sappers over at Dowsing's Point, they'd love to put some food in there and blow up.
So,
a very cheap cost.
I think from an environmental perspective, how we're approaching it is actually cutting off the piles at bed level and dismantling it progressively. In particular, what we're trying to do is focus on the lifting span first. So we'll probably lighten the lifting span and remove that so that we can then establish navigation, and then that enables us to deconstruct the balance of it. So in terms of demolition, it's more of a deconstruction process rather than explosives. But actually, it was interesting that you raised it. There was a presentation by a keynote speaker at the Bridges conference I mentioned before last week, which had the Baltimore Bridge where the massive ship sort of collided, and they actually had to use explosives in that situation because it was unsafe to have people dismantle the section of bridge that was over the ship. So as part of that, they actually did use explosives to break it apart, just the section that was across the bridge, across the vessel. So it has been used in the past.
And the casings that you mentioned for the old bridge, what about the former casing of the circular one on the western side that's still there?
Yes, that will be retained. So
what, for historic reasons or?
Yes, yeah,
So I can imagine the kids are going to love that diving off it.
Quite possibly.
Or we get an influx of seals sort of come up the river and live on it.
And we'll also have the adjacent boat ramp as well, so that'll improve access to the river because the old one wasn't particularly in good condition. So we're hopeful that by re-establishing the boat ramp and providing appropriate parking nearby, we'll see a bit more water usage and the rest. And we're also working with council about making sure that their foreshore trails pass through, and also how the section of foreshore can to the upstream side can be utilised potentially in the interim. So you'd be aware that rail hasn't used the rail network. Obviously, demolishing the existing bridge removes that section of rail. The rail line just further, a few hundred metres further along, remains operating, but there is a section of foreshore there where we'd need to retain a rail corridor, but unless and until rail is identified as being needed, there is no reason why it couldn't be used for the benefit of the community in the meantime. So you can imagine if you put a playground there or something like that, you recognise that in 10 or 20 years, if rail was to become re-implemented, you would need to demolish the playground, but in the meantime, the community has the benefit of that playground. So they're the conversations we're already having with Brighton Council about using that section.
Alderman Marks.
Yes, my question is the artwork that you propose of the old bridge, why isn't Glenorchy getting some of that on our side?
I guess concurrent with that, we are selecting an artist, it's quite finalised, we're selecting an artist to produce artwork for the area I mentioned before, the Aboriginal heritage area. And also as part of our project, I didn't mention it before, that we knew we had to build some noise walls as part of our project. So on the Bridgewater side, a local artist produced artwork that more respected and recognised the old bridge and the lights, whereas on the Glenorchy side, we engaged an Aboriginal artist to recognise the Aboriginal heritage of the area. So we have already incorporated some artwork on the Glenorchy side, but we're in the process of selecting a further Aboriginal artist to produce artwork to be incorporated in that Aboriginal heritage zone.
Any other comments? So, Ben, I'd just like to commend the whole project. I particularly liked the partnership with the Bridge Art Project. I thought that was an absolute sensational outcome of a very industrial project with fine arts, and the outcome was spectacular. Do you think that will be an ongoing project, or is it a once-off?
I probably should give full credit to where credit's due. That is actually an initiative implemented by our contractor. So it wasn't an obligation under the contract. It was something that they thought would return benefit to the community. They recognised that they were part of the community. So effectively, the prize was developed through the project director, purchased a house and living in Norfolk, got to know a few of the locals and understood there was a real passion around art and the likes. So he then basically ran the hat around both his company, McConnell Dow, to gain sponsorship, and then they rattled the hat with a range of other subcontractors, and they were able to raise a significant amount of money to put in place that art prize. So it was an initiative driven by our contractor. We have queried them about whether they'll implement that on their future projects, and they weren't committal, but it's certainly, I think, a really good exercise. And I think any of these projects, there are initiatives there which are funded by the state and undertaken by the state, such as the artwork that I've referred to as being procured by the state. And there's other initiatives where good contractors recognise that to maintain a good social licence and be part of the community, they really need to step up themselves. And I guess McConnell Dow is a good example of where they put that in place, along with all their other subcontractors. It wouldn't have been successful without the contributions from all their subbies as well. So hopefully it sets the benchmark for a number of our other Tasmanian contractors and other big projects to see the importance and benefit of working collaboratively with the community and doing those kind of initiatives. And I think probably didn't touch on the presentation. By going through the procurement process we did and establishing our team the way we did, mentioned at the start, the fact is we haven't built a bridge of this scale for a really long time. We're not going to again for a really long time. So we kept our team small. The members of my team maxed at 8 people, was as low as 5. We've got about 6 on the team at the moment. So 6 or 8 people on a $750 million project, any interstate project doing similar thing would have 30 or 40 people on their team. What we deliberately did was set up a small team, and then we worked really hard to build good, strong relationships with technical experts and external consultants and utilise their skills and abilities, so being able to ask the right questions and gain their input, and also engage with a contractor that had a really strong focus on delivering the project. So it meant that we weren't going to be consuming huge amounts of time and resources and doing a lot of contractual administration. We actually worked through as many of the issues before they became issues. So through that, I think we're able to successfully deliver a project with a relatively small state team by nurturing and really building those collaborative relationships with our consultant and our contractor. Now, any of these projects, I'd be lying if you said that, you know, there weren't challenges, and there aren't challenges on these complex commercial projects. But broadly, the teams adopted a best for project approach. So generally, we tried to find a solution and then resolve sort of how to deal with it second. The first thing was, how do we keep the project moving ahead? How do we deal with the issue? How do we get the best solution as best for project? And I think quite often in major projects, the emphasis always goes back to the strict contract or whatever, but what keeps these projects going really is the relationships. So the relationships within the team, but I think also the relationships external to the team. I like to think we've maintained a good relationship with each of the councils, including Glenorchy City Council, and broadly with the community. We knew that our works were going to be disruptive, and we knew we were coming into an environment that was already had significant traffic congestion, and we weren't going to make it any better until we finished the project. So throughout the life of the project, we worked really, really hard around the traffic staging and trying to minimise the impacts as much as we could, and communicating it as much as possible. I think quite often people can understand disruption and impact if they're well informed and can understand the reason for it. So throughout the life of the project, we've been working really hard to get the information out and also demonstrate ongoing progress. If people see things are happening, then they're less critical. If they see you standing around leaning on a shovel and nothing's happening, well, they're having to wait at a traffic light, they get very upset. So that constant progression of the project was also important.
Yes, I was just going to say I'm just astounded with this project because in my previous public life, I've been out in many a press conference, photo shoot, trying to get funding for that bridge, and to suddenly see it just pop out of the ground as this magnificent piece of infrastructure it just really highlights how bad the old one was when you drive past it. So what lessons have you learned from this? So that, I mean, I think it was 20 years in campaigning to get the funding for this bridge. Is there some way, now we know about the cost benefits ratio and the partnerships and all the things we need to do to prove that we can create a project that will get federal government funding, i.e. I'm thinking of the Tasman Bridge here. Have you got those lessons now so that we don't have to be protesting for 20 years to get the funding?
I think one of the key aspects is providing confidence to those that are funding it. So the way we structured not only our procurement or our planning approval, but also our funding approval for our project was in such a way where we developed up our early cost estimate of the project and what we anticipated. That was sufficient information to then go into that procurement process I mentioned before. We worked with the two contractors all the way through to awarding the successful tender. Now, through that process, the reality is the industry was changing. We were seeing cost escalation starting to come through. Also, what was evolving is that each of our contractors were identifying that there were challenges associated with our preferred we came up with a reference design that utilised the existing causeway with the perception that that may indeed reduce cost. The reality was that each of our contractors identified that it would have been too risky to use the existing causeway. It would have been vulnerable to earthquake and a range of other reasons. So as it was evolving, it was becoming clear that each of the solutions that we were going to come up with at the end was going to be a bridge that was independent of the existing causeway. And that informed us sort of where the costs were going. And also through that time, we also engaged through the planning approval process, which increased some aspects of the scope of the project, including having a on-ramp on the Bridgewater side for Boyer Road. So those sorts of things put cost pressure on, but it did mean that through that whole process, we were able to continue to liaise both with the Australian government and Tasmanian government to make sure that we're still on track. So basically the questions were asked, do you want us to cut scope in order to bring it back within budget, or do we deliver the best value for money outcome? And fortunately, the guidance we're receiving both from the Australian government and Tasmanian government was proceed with delivering the best value outcome for the community. And that's what we presented to government at the end of that year, December 2021, and we were able to secure the additional funding necessary to deliver that project. Now, I'd probably make an observation here, it's not a position on behalf of government, but our timing was very fortunate. We presented that business case going into a federal election. Timing is so critical. Very early in my career, I learned that when I was involved in planning the new Royal Hobart Hospital at Mac Point and handing down a $1.5 billion business case for a new hospital at Mac Point in the middle of a global financial crisis. And obviously that didn't transpire. We proceeded to redevelop the existing site. So timing is quite critical, but I go back to the earlier point. I think it's so important that funders have confidence by understanding that you've appropriately managed the risks, that you've worked through, and the solution that you've got is value for money, and it's going to deliver the benefits that they're seeking to achieve. And it's all of those things that we put together at that end of 2021 that secured the commitment of both the Australian government and the Tasmanian government for the project. How you avoid the preceding 2 decades, probably can't comment too much on that in the sense of how you get to that point. But I think that Tasmania has been able to demonstrate that we can do this, that we can do projects of this scale successfully, and that would build confidence with funders such as the Australian government.
And is it true you're now on the building the wharf?
At Devonport?
Yes.
So I myself and another colleague that worked on Bridgewater Bridge were asked by the government last year to get involved and provide assistance. So we provided assistance to TT Line to establish basically a project management team with the right expertise to deliver that project. So very early in the piece, it was identified that what they really needed to bring on board was better expertise. So they have brought on board a project director, the same project director that delivered Geelong upgrades. And they've established the team, and over the course of the period from the middle of last year through to about a month or so ago, they were going through basically a project reset, and that reset the scope, it reset the agreement that they had with their main contractor. You will see now on site that the works in the marine works are proceeding along with the civil works. It rebalanced or reset the budget and locked in the commitment of time frame. So back in October of last year, the report that was produced by the state government with input from myself and Peter Gemmell indicated that we felt that if it wasn't effectively managed, there was the potential for the project to go into basically 2027. But everyone knew that it was so critical that we didn't have to go through another summer season without the terminal coming online. So most recently, the government and TT Line have announced that they have confidence that they will complete the works necessary to have the berths operating by October of next year. So we will need to get through this coming summer, but it will be operational before the next summer. So TT Line now has in place a good, solid project management team. They've renegotiated their contract, they've reset their budget, and they've reset their program. So from there, it's a matter of seeing that project through.
Very good. That's restoring confidence. Almost late.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I always enjoy your presentations, Ben. And just for your information, my first item when I came on council in March 1991 was the Bridgewater Bridge. I can see it. I've kept it at home actually, and the cost, quite obviously, was quite low. But what was frustrating for that, for the next probably you've outlined it, a lot of planning went on and whatever, but not much happened. I think what you've brought to it with your team is just the excitement in its stages, and then the final, being opening and whatever. I think it's that excitement. I mean, that's why I call it. You go past and where is that and whatever. And I don't think you should undersell that. That people like that. They really did like that, and they understood, why their road that was blocked for a while or whatever, because they could actually see something. So after that 20 odd years that I've just spoken about, nothing seemed to happen, but quite obviously some planning must have happened. It really happened. So I think you commended for that. What I'm interested in is, because I don't like to waste space, the casting area where the concrete is, where you're done. Could something like that area, like that, being used for a stadium or for associated things that have been mentioned, admin areas and training areas for footy clubs and whatever, could that be done and transferred by road from that site?
So precast concrete units, definitely. So I think that the developer's intention is to have that flexibility.
Right.
He has mentioned, before, like for instance, construction of precast housing and the like. But yes, it is a perfect setup there to do prefabrication of units, be that concrete or otherwise, and transport them from there. So it can handle very large elements. You'd imagine your big construction projects would rely upon a certain amount of precast.
Sure.
Stadiums are a good example of something that typically requires precast units. But having said that, probably important to note, Tasmania's got a really good precast industry. We saw that with the redevelopment of Royal Hobart Hospital. One of the things we're really proud about is the quality of precast being delivered by local contractors. So there is a capacity there. The extra facility there increases that capacity. But yeah, don't talk down the existing capability that we have here in Tassie.
Thanks, Neil.
Thank you. Well, that brings to an end our presentation. Thank you very much, Ben Maloney. It was very generous of you to give your time and come and talk to us all.
Very good.
And it was a fascinating project, and all credit to you and your team for producing something we can all be proud of, and it will provide brilliant infrastructure for many generations to come. So it's a lovely thing to have on your resume.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
And with that, we'll bring our open workshop to a close. We thank you for watching. We hope you find it interesting, and you can always review it through YouTube or Facebook.